Hello, welcome to Football Geeks. My guest is an author of two books, Origin Stories, The Pioneers Who Took Football to the World, and The Defiant, The History of Football Against Fascism, which we will be affording sharper focus in this episode. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Chris Lee. Chris, hi.
Hi Phil, how are you going?
I'm very well, mate. It's great to have you on the show. Recently read The Defiant. It's a fabulous read. We're going to stick with one area of the book. Although, if you wish to bring in other areas as to contrast, that'll be absolutely fine. But I suspect the first question to ask is, where did your enjoyment of football begin? Who were the teams you supported? Who were the players who excited you? All the usual stuff that makes us love this game.
Fair enough. I think, well, I became kind of aware of football, I should say, in the mid-'80s, I suppose, when I was still in single digits. So I was lapsed Queen's Park Rangers supporter, not from West London, just like the kit. But I got into football because of primarily the Le Carré Magique, which, of course, anyone who supported the French team in the mid-'80s will know as Michel Platini, Alain Giresse, Chanty Guénard, and Alain Fernandez, who were the magic square, basically, of the great European champions in 1984, semi-finalists in 82 and 86. And I think one of the first matches I ever watched was Brazil against France in 1986, which, if anyone hasn't seen it, which is quite possibly quite a lot of your audience, just go on YouTube and have a look, because it's like the meeting of kind of one waning giant in Brazil who really peaked in 82 with Socrates, Zico, and the like, coming up against France, who were European champions, and it's absolutely brilliant. And I think that sort of got me into football. I idolised England midfielders like Brian Robson and Glenn Hoddle at the time, who were kind of glamorous players and much underrated. I think it's forgotten nowadays. Not forgotten so much as just kind of like forget how good they were, because I don't imagine there's as much footage of them, as you get as much now of the modern player. But that's kind of how I got into it, kind of stuck with it ever since, believe it or not.
Yeah, I think football in around that era, it was very much you had to be in the ground to enjoy it, didn't you? But when you saw teams like France in 1984, well, to be fair, in 1984 there wasn't much coverage of that tournament, so it's all done in hindsight. But the '86 World Cup, that magnificent game against Brazil that you refer to, that was a team that were reaching their peak. To be undone by West Germany in the semi-final, weren't they? Which always seemed to be the way. They were one step away, and the '98 team were possibly inferior. Inferior is possibly the wrong word, but not as great as the French team of 1984. They were a team of real greatness.
Yeah, I think also a lot of it's to do with when you become cognizant of. I had this chat with Stephen Scragg, who's written 4 books on football. And he says it's usually your first World Cup or wherever you are in your early teens that you really associate with. And for me, '86 will always be the best World Cup. Not just the first I thought, it's because it was in Mexico. It's big grounds, big crowds, we should say. Everything was sunshine. There's some incredible goals in there. And also there's lots and lots of controversy, as we know. In fact, in the space of, I'd like to say one of the very first matches I ever watched was England, Argentina quarterfinal, and within the space of 6 minutes, you had the best goal and the most controversial goal in history. And if that's your first introduction to football, it's all downhill from there, frankly. So, never quite reached that side.
We said that even in that moment before Diego issued us that hand of God moment, the play prior to that was quite incredible. This fast kind of passage of play where he's trying to make things happen, and invariably does. But then it's tainted by that moment that we'll always remember. But it's true what you say about being a product of your time. Steve, when I've spoken to him, he talks about which Doctor Who you like the most when you were a child, and that kind of earmarks where you are in history, really. So moving on, Chris, you've written 2 terrifically well-received books to date. So what, in your own words, are the characteristics of a Chris Lee book?
Well, basically, if I dial back to my dissertation. So my day job, just to fill everyone in, my day job is I work in digital marketing, public relations, and things like that. So I write a lot of content about technology, things like that. So it's always a bit of an escape to sort of write about things you're interested in. So I do it as a hobby first and foremost. So I found myself traveling a lot with work, back in sort of 2015ish. So I thought, you know what, I'm going to set up a a blog to carry, because if I go to say Amsterdam, I'd go and see Ajax, maybe get the train down to Antwerp and watch Royal Antwerp. And I started a blog outside right, and then followed by a podcast, do that. And then this all kind of stems very much from my interest in the confluence of sport and politics, really, which goes back way back to my dissertation, which was completed in 1998. And at that point, the only book in English that was about football and politics was Simon Cooper's Football Against the Enemy, which I'm sure most people have read. If not, get on it. It's a great book. It does all the classic rivals, like West Germany against Holland back in the day, or Germany against Holland as it is now. Netherlands, I should say, sorry. And, Barca Madrid, which is what my topic of my dissertation, because I was in Spain doing Erasmus student. And I did sort of regional identity in Spain, because I had a European studies degree. It had to be politically based. A lot of people were doing like, fishing policy, and I was like, do you know what? I want to do something a bit more up my street that I know something about. So I was like, can I please do football and regional identity in Spain? Of course, luckily I had a lecturer who would bat for me on this one, because a lot of the people didn't understand it, because football in England is not political. It is a little bit in Scotland, I guess, with the old firm, but down south it's not really. So I convinced them. I said, look, Madrid Barca is a thing. Athletic club has their own identity, Barcelona, etc. And it's really interesting how through history it's happened. Obviously, Spanish politics is really quite. There's a word in Spanish, crispación, which is a lot of tension, and obviously morbo as well, which some people are familiar with, which is a bit of the tension that comes with rivalry. And it's kind of I convinced them that this is I should write this dissertation. And I did, and I got a 2-1 in the end, so I was really pleased with that. But I kind of parked that for several years, and then the idea of the first book came along, because it's becoming more accessible to become an author nowadays. Like I said, there was only one book on sport and politics back then. Now I think it's more of a respected kind of field of study, university of study and everything like that. So Origin Stories was the first one, which I know we're going to talk about a little bit later on, which is about, it's a country by country story of basically of how, in rough chronological order, how the game got started. So we start obviously look at England and how the rule book came together, and the early clubs, early attempts at leagues, cups, moved to Scotland. A lot of kind of accelerated the development, especially in the passing game at Queen's Park and things like that. And then they basically did Wales, Ireland, and France, and it goes on so through different countries. And then during lockdown, I found myself this first book had gone out, and I thought, you know what? One of the themes that emerged from that was, football and how it started to be used by Muslims, because it was a bit of a crossover period. I did up to the 1930 World Cup with Origin Stories, but Italy had its first decade by then of Mussolini, and he was the first guy to use football as a political tool. And I thought, you know what, we've done a lot of like football and fascism books, like how did Mussolini use it, how did Franco use it? What about the converse? What was football against fascism? Has that been looked at? Not really in one complete package. No one had written about in English about the 1969 Portuguese Cup final, for example, which is fascinating, how it sort of like helped topple the dictatorship of Western Europe's longest running dictatorship. No one written about Greek partisans. Only a couple of books have been written about or have covered Hajduk Split's role, which I know we're going to talk about. A lot have been done about the death match in 1942, which we'll talk about as well. It's kind of mythologized. And so I thought, let's bring all this together. Let's have a complete picture of what it's like football against fascism. And that's kind of where the Defiant came from, really. It was a lockdown project.
And I mean, you've sort of introed what we are going to talk about. So we are focusing on the Defiant today, and it's a book that explores the seemingly perennial, ongoing battle against fascism, and it covers the Iberian Peninsula, Italy, Central and Western Europe, Latin America, and also Britain. But I've rather greedily asked you to talk about my supported area of expertise, which is East Europe and the Balkans. So do you want to run us through a few examples of the kind of fights against fascism that took place in those areas?
Firstly, thank you for asking me about this area, because a lot of what I've focused on before has been Mussolini and Franco and sort of usual suspect type stuff. It's great to be talking about this pretty much uncovered, and this chapter, Eastern Europe, was possibly the bleakest of the lot, to be honest with you. It's quite dark. You go into those sort of places, a lot of like prison camp activity and things like that. And obviously then it didn't come, there was a happy ending in Italy in many ways. It got rid of it, had a democracy come out of it. West Germany had a democracy come out of it. France had a democracy come out of it. Spain eventually, and Portugal had democracies come out of it, but the East Europeans went from one dictatorship, Nazism, basically into communism for another 45 years. And then we're seeing the sort of fallout of that still, as you know. So firstly, let's talk about what is fascism to start with. So when I mentioned Mussolini came in 1920s, basically that fascism comes from the fascio, which is the bundle. So basically, it's like you think about ultranationalism, control of the courts, control of usually a kind of anti-foreign element to that. So there's an otherism to it, which, as we know, who the target groups were under Nazism, and so this kind of like what happened in 1939, September 1st, is the Germans had agreed with the Soviets, the Molotov-Ribbentrop pact, which basically meant like, let's invade Poland together and then share the spoils, which did happen. So 1st of September, the Nazis came in from the west. The Soviets didn't attack till a couple of weeks later, I think 17th. So Poland was the very first kind of, the first part of World War II to happen. And France and Britain declare war on Germany on 3rd of September. Don't really get active until, I guess, when France gets attacked and eventually overrun. But over in the east, Germany's just basically taken over, and so is the Soviet Union is part of it. And this is kind of quite interesting. I think Poland was a really interesting example of where footballers get involved. So some of them were killed on the front trying to defend either side, east or west. But out of all the occupied countries in Eastern Europe, Poland's the only one that's actually where sport is banned, because obviously they feared the gathering of the mob, so to speak, the power of the mob. However, football goes underground. It's quite interesting in Poland. They have leagues in Krakow, for example, where they have a place called Park Juvenia, so Juvenia Park, where kind of on the edge of the city, where you basically have spotters. You'd have hundreds of people come to watch matches. So you'd have the classic holy war, as it's called, the derby between Wisła Krakow and Cracovia. They'd be playing each other along with 8 other local teams for a championship, basically. The spotters would see it, and if they see the Germans come in, they'd basically just like warn everyone, and everyone would scarper. Similarly, up in Warsaw, the same thing was happening at a place called Mokotów Park. So there were, famous clubs like Polonia playing there, and they even had like winners' medals and things, which had the crest of the city, was a sort of mermaid on a ball. So it's quite like quite interesting how sort of like the level of intricacy that went on in these things. So they went on. Some of the players in Warsaw, in particular, went on to take part in the Warsaw Uprising in August 1944, which unfortunately ended in kind of defeat for them, and Warsaw was razed to the ground as a result, because they lost, because the Soviets kind of just sat it out and let the two wear each other down before they themselves crossed the river. So it's quite, as I said, quite bleak sort of chapter, really. I think Ukraine gave us the most famous of them all of the incidents, which is the 1942 death match, which I think a lot of people know is kind of the inspiration for Escape to Victory, which is what I opened the Defiant with, actually, because I think this is the most classic example that everyone knows, really, of football against fascism, right? So it's like people think they know the story, and it's actually mythologized in post-war Soviet kind of lore, really, or sort of a mythology that around what actually happened to the players. So in the Soviet kind of version, this team from Ukraine, which was actually called FC Start from Kiev, and made up of Lokomotiva and Dynamo Kiev players. They took on a German team from the Luftwaffe called the Flak Elf, the 11th of the Flak Department, which is obviously, shoot guns up in the air to stop planes. And they won, and then according to the Soviet story, they were all taken off and shot. And it's like, no, that's not what happened. They won a match, a famous match, the death match, but that was part of a whole series of games, like a whole season, basically, which was basically bread and circuses from the Nazis, which was get the locals distracted, give them a football league to play in, even though they're starving and things like that. And by the way, here's a couple of our regiments to play in as well. So despite being underfed and intimidated and having the ref against them, they still win this match 5-2 or 5-3. I can't remember exactly the scoreline. It was quite a high scoring game. And 4 of the players did eventually die at the hands of the Nazis several weeks after. but for different reasons, not related to the football. That's just more coincidental. The kind of law of averages would have them do that anyway. Over in Russia, we have other examples as well. I mean, everyone probably knows that the Nazis got to the gate through Operation Barbarossa when they turned against the Nazis, and having failed to secure surrender from Britain, turned the other way. Big mistake. Repeating what Napoleon did, which was basically not secure it before winter. They got to the gates of Moscow. Moscow defended very well, and also you had the world's most bloodiest single battle, of course, which is the siege of Stalingrad. The footballers who were involved in that, they didn't. The local side is called Traktor, the tractor, basically from the tractor factory. They were offered the chance to go to Siberia and escape, but they didn't. They chose to stay and fight. Some of them involved in quite daring raids, sabotaging supply lines and things like that. And so after the Germans retreat out of Stalingrad, there is a kind of a football match to celebrate the liberation, effectively, of what is left of Stalingrad anyway. So it's rubble by this point. But they found a football pitch where they could gather, and some several thousand fans did come to watch Traktor play. I think it's Spartak Moscow, one of the famous Muscovite clubs that came down.
Yeah,
And
Spartak,
yeah, and they bought they flew the match ball in with an airplane, a fighter plane, and then the pilot dropped the ball onto the pitch from like low flood, basically doing a buzz, when they buzz the tower type thing. So that's quite fascinating from that regard. And obviously that club still exists, Traktor. They're now called Rotor Volgograd because Volgograd is the name of Stalingrad after it got renamed. So yeah, there's plenty out there. And one of the other favorite stories I'm sure you've come across is the Hajduk Split story. Hajduk Split, obviously one of the big two in what is now Croatia, or was at the time Yugoslavia in World War II, became sort of Tito's kind of Marshal Tito's kind of propaganda arm almost. They were sort of like an ambassadorial thing. They dissolved themselves rather than join when basically Croatia was annexed originally by the Italians, and they offered Split to join Serie A, and Hajduk would have become Associazione di Calcio Spalato, which is like, Spalato is the name for Split in Italian. They said no, we'd rather dissolve ourselves, so they did, and then they reformed on the island of Vis a few years later, which is famous for where Mamma Mia 2 was filmed, and those who've seen it, and they basically became kind of like Tito's, travel around the Med playing teams. They played British Army team famously in Bari. They lost 7-2. That British Army team contained Stan Cullis, who famously was Wolves and refused to do the Nazi salute back in 1938 in Berlin, and also Tom Finney, who was very young at the time as well. So it wasn't a bad match, bad team, but they did eventually beat a British team on it was Boxing Day, Boxing Day 1944, just as the Germans were retreating. So it's only 10 kilometers from the actual front line at that point. And just to say that we're back in business, Croatia or Yugoslavia will be free. They just held this match with tens of thousands of people present, and just miles from the front line. So they're kind of, it's a really interesting story, really, about how and this during those matches when the new Yugoslav flag, which is a bit like the Dutch flag with red, white, and blue horizontal stripes with a red star through it. That's when the first time it was kind of flown, was at that Bari match that I mentioned. So it's kind of significant. Football is the significant propaganda tool for Marshal Tito, who of course comes in and kind of runs Yugoslavia till the 80s, and after he died is when it disintegrated, as we know. So that's kind of the key stories, really, in a nutshell, of what's going on there. I can also uncover Greece if you'd like, which is pretty much a similar story. Occupied by the Italians originally. Again, Italy pretty much from the off were retreating. They weren't really after some initial gains. They were losing everywhere, which dragged resources away from the Nazis, other parts of Europe for them. They had to go down and do the fighting for them. But similar story, basically, a lot of footballers signed up, especially from the big clubs like Olympiacos and Panathinaikos. They had players who fought in the regiments. Quite a few of them died as well, actually. But one of the incidents, again, talking about like football as a propaganda tool, the stadium manager of, I think it was a Panathinaikos ground, was the first to raise the Greek flag after, before the Germans had even left Athens, when they were withdrawing. So they knew it was coming to an end, but he just boldly put up the Greek flag on, and that's kind of like seen as a big moment. So there's plenty going on there. Football was part of the resistance. I just want to sort of make that point and highlight those stories really for people.
It was a very interesting. I mean, the Yugoslavs had kind of anti-fascist sentiments anyway. A lot of their soldiers fought in the Spanish Civil War. I think
They did.
you mentioned that in your book, don't you? And one of the great stories about Greece was the Panathinaikos game at the Leophorus, where money was the money that was being raised was to rebuild a hospital in Athens, I think. And the Germans demanded a cut, so the Greeks just shut the game down.
Shut the game down and ripped up the stadium.
That's it. 15,000 fans inside the stadium with no game to watch, and
No.
I'm sure that rankled and spurred a bit of anti-fascist stroke anti-German sentiment as well.
Definitely.
So we'll take a leap forward into the communist era, and it heralded the birth of National Socialism, which was an awkward oxymoron, with some of the Soviet states, pilot states, where there were instances where communism resembled fascism during the decades after World War II. Was there any kickback against the oppression during the post-war years?
Well, it's a very different sort of. They swap one dictatorship for another, and this dictatorship lasted, I've mentioned, till 1990, 89, 90. When did it all come down? November 89, wasn't it?
Yeah, November 89.
Yeah, and so basically, I guess it took a couple of years after that. I think the Soviet Union had dissolved by Christmas Day 91, and so kind of the geography is kind of where it is now. So you have countries like, well, what was Czechoslovakia, now became Czechia and Slovakia and places like this. Yugoslavia, as we know, in the 90s kind of dissolved into the various different parts. But during that period of immediately post-war, a lot of the clubs were kind of taken over by the state. And so you get a trait, which I think people have seen, if you're the works team, because it's communist. So the Lokomotiv would be from the railway yard. Suska meant the army team, the CSKA. So Suska Sofia, Suska Moskva. Dinamo is the team of the police. Dinamo Berlin, possibly most famously, and I think we'll come to them in a minute. Yeah. Dinamo Zagreb, Dinamo Tbilisi, all these people, and then Traktor we mentioned, and Torpedo is another one from the sort of automotive sector. So these are the sort of clubs that are, everything was collectivized, I guess, even within that sort of sphere. But it's quite interesting how it became kind of intrinsically linked with political ambitions internally as well. So you get the Stasi club, or linked to the Stasi, Dinamo Berlin, for example, who won 10 straight titles in the 1980s, made very little impression in Europe, and that's probably because they weren't getting challenged at home, So as much so when they walked their own Oberliga in the East Germany, and then as soon as they got into the European games, they didn't get very far really. No. But no, so that's a fascinating area of study which has been done. There's quite a few kind of books out there on that. I recommend anyone look at the People's Game by Alan McDougall, which is all about the game in East Germany actually, and Richard Mills' book on Yugoslavia. So there's plenty sort of looking at how the game was sort of structured in Eastern Europe and various countries. So that's the sort of general. Like, they wouldn't really sort of get that sort of level of resistance. I think the biggest victim of any resistance was probably the Hungarian national side. If you look at how strong they were in '53, beating England, and then winning the Olympics in '52, and then of course, I'd say choking the World Cup final, but they certainly 2-0 up against West Germany should have put it to bed really and won the World Cup in 1954. But then after '56, there's a Hungarian uprising, and the team kind of disbands. They go abroad like Puskás, and Kubala end up in Spain. And so, yeah, that's kind of one of the biggest victims of, I suppose, the big lost opportunity that was because of resistance to the communist regime in Eastern Europe.
Yeah, Hungary never really recovered, did they,
No.
from that loss of player, Kocic and Hidakuti, and all these players who went to, to the moneyed shores of the Mediterranean and beyond in some cases.
Mm.
So upon the fall of communism on the European continent between 89 and 92,
Mm.
East Europe imploded, and new statesmen were preaching right-wing rhetoric again. Wasn't it? It was the
Mm.
re-emergence of fascism in Europe, and these guys found their way into power. So, what were the significant stories and the significant personalities in this kind of full circle return to the bad old days?
Yeah, I spoke to someone who looked at Croatian ultras in particular, and this is quite interesting because we've already mentioned how Hajduk was really important to the, the emergence of what was communist stroke socialist Yugoslavia post World War II, and they did quite well, quite an affluent country actually, Yugoslavia. Excuse me, and reasonably independent of Moscow compared to other satellite states. But I guess what's one of those sort of generational, what he was saying is a bit one of those generational rebellion things. So you've gone from communism, and then people, well, what's the opposite?
Yeah,
Fascism.
yeah,
So I actually found this myself personally when I I actually put a blog post out. I said these are most 11 historically significant football clubs, and Sheffield FC, Queens Park, Dick Kerr ladies, all these sort of usual, so Corinthians, all these sort of usual ones. And then I put down Hajduk Split, and for two reasons. One, which we already covered, they're sort of like the flag bearers of Yugoslavia during World War II, but also because they're credited with bringing the torcida, the ultra movement, from seeing Brazilian fans in Brazil in the 1950 World Cup, bringing that back, and then obviously that kind of mixing with the English hooligan culture of the 60s and 70s and 80s became the ultra culture in Italy and other parts of the world. And it was actually the Hajduk Split fans that kind of introduced that kind of the noise, the singing, the pyro, that sort of thing from uh, from South America. So I've put down that they're very significantly important. However, I noticed I was getting a lot of hits from Croatia, and I suddenly got an interview with a Croatian publication, which I later kind of understood I gave them some answers by email and then ran the translation through Google Translate of what they'd written up. But basically, it turned out, it's like I said, it's gone the other way. If anything, like over there, they're kind of almost not as not. I'm surprised they weren't as proud of their World War II kind of record as I thought they would. And so it looks like even though Croatia is the European Union's most recent member, it does appear that there is a slip to the right going on there that we've also seen elsewhere in Europe. And I think most notably where that appears in football is in the former East Germany quite a lot.
yeah.
We've seen an awful lot of far right kind of support over there and activity within football circles, which runs completely converse to. It's not entirely, by the way, as I mentioned in the book. There's like Babelsberg, who are quite kind of left wing from that area. There's also Tennis Borussia, but the difference being Tennis Borussia from Berlin were part of West Germany, effectively West Berlin. The sort of basically not communist Berlin.
Yeah.
For those who remember, Berlin was segmented into four parts, and it was I think it was the British or the American sector that tennis were in. But anyway, so they don't really count from a sort of former communist bloc point of view, but Babelsberg do, and their fans have been involved in some run-ins over the years. So I cover that in the book. But conversely, over in West Germany, former West Germany, obviously you've got the great kind of example of St. Pauli, which is probably the most famous anti-fascist, or the original anti-fascist club in many ways of the modern era, and that's kind of inspired a lot of movements around the place, which I think kind of we've seen, in say Rayo Vallecano in Spain, Bohemians in Ireland, Celtic to a certain extent in Scotland. They're more linked to sort of the Palestinian sort of movement rather than anything else.
Yeah.
But also the lower league in England, and we've got quite a politicised lower league in many ways with Dulwich Hamlet, Clapton, and some other sort of like progressive, I should say, clubs, going on. So it's quite interesting how that sort of like fallout from what was another country's political kind of discussion discourse was kind of like filtered through football, through kind of groundhoppers going abroad, seeing things happening through the internet, which kind of exacerbated it, has kind of made its way over to other countries as well.
Yeah, there are plenty of antidote to the kind of rising fascism. But just a question: why isn't there the legal regulation on fascist behaviour in Eastern European and Balkan countries? Why do you think that's so, Chris?
Don't know. I mean, I can only speculate. I'm not an expert, but I would say they're probably not used to the same level of kind of progressive politics and integration that we've had. And likewise, even if you look at West and East Germany, when they reunified, West Germany was far more diverse because of things like the Gastarbeiter, the guest workers from Turkey, for example, and elsewhere, as opposed to possibly more monocultural, arguably, East Germany. So, you know, I just don't think it's quite as progressed. But that's not to say that it isn't exclusively all like that. There's some great movements in Poland, like the Never Again Association, which I cover in the book, who are doing stuff like education through football. And we know Poland just avoided, in their election, kind of elected a progressive government. But I know that this year is a massive year across Europe in terms of like progressive versus all right. And I don't count. I mean, I count the UK among that as well. I don't think the options. I think we need to be wary of the extreme elements that are at play here as well. But
I just tend to hope that the right-minded people will outweigh the people with those opinions, and I hope to be proven right. But as we know, history has a way of moving in circles, doesn't it, and revisiting old mistakes. Thank you for talking us through that, Chris. But we're going to move on, and I asked you to give us an overview of the other books, which it looks incredibly intriguing too. It's called Origin Stories, isn't it? Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, it's country by country story about the football kind of got started, as I mentioned before. So it's kind of at the beginning, which is kind of just to recap. It's basically I found with lots of interesting books out there, like on that cover football in any particular country. So Morbo for Spain, Tour for Germany, Culture for Italy by John Foot for Italy, Ancient with Dirty Faces for Argentina. There's all these great books out there on individual countries. I thought, they cover the sort of like the roots of the game very quickly, or who are the other characters that help bring the game in, and also let's look at it country by country. Let's see how it started, And like I said, I do it from the very first game, or first club, or whatever it happens to be, up to the 1930 World Cup, where I think by that time we can argue that the game is globalized, because obviously FIFA was founded in 1904, but it's mostly European. But then by 1930, Uruguay, from like far-flung tiny country of like 2 million people, is the best team in the world for best part of a decade. So how's that happen, and why? And so basically that's where kind of I look at. So it starts obviously with starts with Sheffield. Actually starts with Sheffield FC, officially the world's oldest football club, still going. And we're talking about association rules football here, because I know a lot of people will jump in and go, but what about other kicking games before that? And I said that doesn't count, because we're talking about association rules, and that's the association rule book put together in 1863 by the Football Association. So anyone that got the rules from there are playing association rules, right? So this is it. So the association rules are based on what contribution of Sheffield FC, of Cambridge University, of Charterhouse, all these other ones. Obviously the rugby playing schools were involved as well, but obviously they went off and did their own thing, because it was all disagreement about how to tackle and how to handle and how goals were scored and things like that. So all these debates, we look at those debates, the rule books, then look how it spread. So Wrexham was up next, but technically Wales wasn't that big in the developments of the game compared to, say, Scotland, which is really pivotal, especially Glasgow. So the first decade, like Glasgow is like the centre of world football for the 1880s. So lots of things happening there, especially around the first international, 1872, a first official international. There's a couple of attempts at it beforehand, but they weren't really bona fide teams. So then I move on to Wales. I said Ireland. Then France is the continent, so L'Havre, which is the oldest team in France, is 1872. That's really old. Though they're playing some mixed rules and obviously quite away from Paris where the hard things happen. And there's only really two ways that the game leaves Britain, and it's either like people have come here to go to school or something, and they're obviously quite wealthy, and they've gone and said, "I'm taking the game back with them," or it's British expats going around the world, setting up communities, playing on docklands, locos ingleses, as they're known, and that crazy English down in Argentina and Uruguay. By the way, when they say English in South America, it's quite a lazy way of just saying British, which at the time included Irish as well. So there's kind of like you get lots of Irish and Scottish players also involved in say the first kind of iterations of clubs down there, like what was the Central Uruguay Railway Cricket Club, which is now Peñarol, the team of the century in the 20th century in South America. That started off as lots of Brits and Germans, basically, and some locals. It was, inclusive as well. Just kind of like kicking balls around, in their days off and playing on the railway. So it's like there's all those sort of stories really, and how the game got started. I'd go everywhere pretty much with it. The North American chapter is really interesting because people kind of forget that in the 1920s there was a really strong American soccer league, and if it weren't for the crash, Wall Street crash '29, USA could have been a proper player. So,
yeah. I mean, they were in the World Cup. They reached semi-finals of the World Cup around that time, didn't they? So they were an emergent nation.
About 7 of them were Scottish, though, and there was one English player, and the Scottish coach. They actually is about far as Scotland got in the World Cup.
Yeah, and aside from the razzmatazz of the 70s and early 80s, they had to wait another 70 years until they got a really competitive bona fide league, which seems a tragic kind of delay for a nation of that size. They could arguably be the biggest footballing country in the world. I think this is a conversation for another time. I'd love to get you back on the show to talk about that book specifically too, if that's okay. Have you got any other projects in the pipeline? Is there anything that you're working on at the moment, Chris?
I am. I've got basically I kind of like went a bit public with it this week, but I've been people who follow me online would notice I've posted a lot of Irish football recently, and that's because I've got a book coming out next spring about Irish football. So it's basically a bit of ground hopping in both League of Ireland in the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland Football League, or Irish League as it's known, in Northern Ireland. So there's lots of ground hopping, some really good old grounds out there, like the Oval at Glentoran, which I recommend everyone go to before they redesign it. Likewise, Daly Mount and Tolka Park in Dublin. Some really nice sort of regional grounds. There's really good atmosphere. There's great ultra culture going on as well. There's a friendly one as well. So it's not like in Italy where there's an edge of men. It's quite friendly, and it's small as well. So it's it's cheap and accessible. So there's that. There's a lot of history involved. There's a chapter on women's football as well, which I don't think has been really covered. It's been covered a lot, but in more in academic sort of circles rather than actually in a sort of book version. There's a bit about immigrants as well, as I alluded to just now. Actually, like who went down to South America and formed clubs that you may well have heard of, and the international sides as well. So obviously we cover the big, the split between why is there one national Irish rugby club and rugby side and cricket side, but there's two international football sides. How did that happen, and what does that mean? So there's lots of politics involved as well. So all the things I like really, which is a bit of ground hopping, a bit of politics, a bit of history, and mix it all together. So I've got 30 plus interviews for that. So I'm really pleased with how it's coming together, and some great photos. And I hope to get that kind of submitted and in the can this summer and out early next year.
Yeah, it sounds amazing. I like my football with a good side helping of politics as well. So we're on the same page in regard to that. So that's fantastic. Where can people engage with you on these subjects, and also where can they get your books? Where can they get them?
The books are both my books so far come out from Pitch Publishing, so you can find them at pitchpublishing.co.uk. They're available at all the usual suspects. You can follow me at Outside Right. It's WRITE, it's a play on words, it started as a blog. I'm on Twitter, X, Facebook, Instagram, where I'm most active, probably. Blue Sky and Threads for those who are still on it. So you can look up the podcast wherever you get your podcast, look for Outside Right. And there's loads on outsideright.co.uk. So that's pretty much where you can find me.
Yeah, well, I've read it's fantastic, and it does deal with a subject that's recurrent and always delicate.
It seems to get more relevant every day. It's almost like I knew there was, a comeback, but it's quite interesting. Football is getting politicized.
Of course, yeah. In Europe, and unfortunately, it seems like it's going to be around, as there's right-minded. Football being one, will continue to stand in the way of this perennial battle against this kind of oppression and misappropriation of power. Chris, it's been fantastic talking to you. Thank you for coming on the show, and hopefully we'll see you again in the near future, and we'll talk about the other book.
Happy to come on.
And hope to talk about this book about Irish football as well. That sounds amazing. So
yeah, definitely.
So thank you again, Chris, and we'll see you next time on Football Geeks. Bye for now.
Absolutely. Thank you.